Well, good afternoon if you are in Kennett, Missouri, or Cleveland, Ohio, or New York, New York, or anywhere in North and South America or Central America. Good evening if you are in Europe or Africa. Special love, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. Stay strong. We are with you. Almost everybody in the world supports you. And greetings to listeners all around the world, including loved ones in Russia as well. My name is Fred Plotkin, so this must be Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know by now, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I'm thrilled to have my guest today. His name is Limmie Pulliam. He's a tenor. But he's much more than that. He is, in our opera community, a much loved figure by fellow artists and by people such as myself. I'm not a performer, but I work in opera and I think the world of him. And I'm very happy he's joining us today from Cleveland, Ohio, where he is currently appearing in concert versions with the Cleveland Orchestra of Puccini's La Fanciulla del West in the role of Dick Johnson, which is not a nice name for an opera figure. It's kind of redundant. But Limmie, welcome very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Fred.
So Limmie, I want to start by going over familiar territory with you for the viewers who may not know it, but then we're going to go away from that. You are from Kennett, Missouri, which, as you told me, is as southeast in the state of Missouri as you can get. Talk about life growing up there musically, but also in terms of family, and where Kennett is in relation to other places that listeners around the world might know.
Well, I grew up in, as you said, in Kennett, Missouri. It's a small town of a little over 11,000 people. I was the youngest of 10 children, born to my mom and dad, Limmie Sr., and so I'm Limmie Jr. Kennett is nestled in the southeastern corner of the state, which we call the Boot Heel, and it's about 100 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, and about 200 miles south of St. Louis. So it's it's kind of nestled right there in the corner. We're about as far south in Missouri as you can go without getting into Arkansas. I'm literally 5 minutes from the Arkansas border.
Is it near the Mississippi River?
It's about 17 miles off of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River runs to our east. It's a sleepy little town, rural town that has an immense love for the arts. And that was one of the things that's been so prevalent about when most people learn about our town is the amount of musicians this little town has produced. It was my middle school and high school choir director who was responsible for introducing me to opera. And she, over the years has shaped so many other performers and whatnot. Let's see, Cheryl Crow is from Kennett, Missouri. Her mother was my piano teacher in high school. Others who have come, David Nail, who's a relatively well-known country artist, Trent Tomlinson, who's a well-known country artist and songwriter, Gene McDonald, who is a bass who sings with the Gaither Family Band, and so many others. My cousin Vita Brown, who recorded with Stax Records back in the 70s.
That one I knew.
And so it's I have a cousin, Jamie Rowland, Jamie Chase, who's a well-known performer in the Kansas City area with her band. And this small town has of course most towns have their love of athletics, but there was something about Kennett that the arts also took a front seat, whether it was instrumental, whether it was vocal. The community would always come out and support it, and had begun encouraging me from I'd say an early age, when I discovered that I had somewhat of a knack for operatic or classical singing. So it's a wonderful little town. I still live there today. I moved back in 2007, and have been there since. And it's a lovely place to call home.
So is Memphis your main airport, or what would your airport be?
Yeah, I typically fly out of Memphis, and I usually choose between Memphis or St. Louis. If I have some time, I'll go to St. Louis because I have family there, so I can see siblings and whatnot. So,
for people who don't know America, or even Americans such as myself, I've been to most states. I've been to 40 states out of the 50, but I've not been to Missouri yet. But when you look at Missouri, or Missouri on the map, apparently that's how you say it, part of it, your part kind of curls into what we call the South. Parts of it border on Iowa, a lot of it borders on Illinois, on Kansas, on, I don't know about Nebraska, maybe
Oklahoma,
so. Oklahoma,
the Kentucky and
Kentucky, that's right. So therefore, whatever our perception is of these different states, all of them border on Missouri, and therefore I would think that Missouri draws from all of those and contributes to all of those. It's called the Show Me State, I know that. St. Louis had the World's Fair in 1904 and the Olympics, right? That was the Olympics? I know, yes. New York City, we still have not managed that. St. Louis had the Olympics in 1904. I know that the ice cream cone was invented in St. Louis at the World's Fair. I'm a huge baseball fan, and the team that I respect most, that's not the one I root for, are the St. Louis Cardinals. They have a wonderful tradition. St. Louis, Opera St. Louis, Opera Theater St. Louis is a very famous company for developing operas, some of which recently have come to the Metropolitan Opera, including Fire, Shut Up in My Bones, and Champion. They recently did Regina, which I would love to have seen, the Mark Blitzstein opera that starred Susan Graham and Susanna Phillips, and that would have been great. And it's a very well-regarded company, as is Kansas City, for its music, for its fountains. Mark Twain, Harry Truman. There's a lot that I know, Yogi Berra, that I know about your state. Scott Joplin, yes, of course, thank you. That I intend, the second most famous journalism school in America after Columbia University. I almost went to the University of Missouri for journalism. I went to Columbia, but I seriously considered Missouri. And so it's a state that really profiles and represents a lot of America in its good and in its bad, and it's yet to be improved. And so it's a source of real fascination for me that I intend to come there. But you early in your life wanted to be a singer. You studied at Oberlin, which is one of our great schools. I had a guest on recently, we spoke about Oberlin, and it's very famous for music, for fostering creativity, for allowing you to be you, whatever the you is, and very, very well regarded. But then at a certain point in your early 20s, you were on a trajectory to sing, but you stopped singing. Why was that?
Well, I just recently made my quote unquote professional debut, and was, had been doing some auditions and whatnot, and things just weren't going as I would have liked. And some of the feedback that I was getting was to me was rather troublesome. So I decided that maybe it's time to find something else to do in life, to try another trajectory and pursue some of my other interests. So I did. I took the time away and spent some time working in other industries, from credit card collections to bodyguarding celebrities, so and into politics and everything in between. So I was able to pursue several different things during that time, and eventually ended up having my own security firm based in St. Louis, where we provided protection services for VIPs, celebrities, and special events, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and still sometimes today even miss it now.
Mhm.
But it was just it was one of those things that I thought it was necessary to stay true to my word to myself, that if for some reason music ever stopped being enjoyable, it's time to find something else. And I was no longer able to enjoy the process of making music.
I'm gonna ask you a question. I wonder if other people have asked you this question. In working in security and looking after celebrities and politicians, but really, let's say celebrities, did you gain any insights into the kind of lives that they lead in terms of their privacy, their vulnerability, their need for certain things? I mean, emotional and just time alone or creative time alone, that helped you better understand the life of being a public person, because you are now a public person.
Yes, and I did, because it, as a person who was providing them for their protection, you share very intimate spaces with these people. You're in positions with them in a position of trust, so you become privy to certain aspects of their life that others within their camp may not have. Whether it's dealing with their family, finances, any of their personal shortcomings, their children. So you become involved in aspects of their life that most people will never gain access to. And so it's inherent that you that that you're a trustworthy person, someone that they can depend on and know that they can trust with just about any aspect of their life. And it has given me a lot of insight on how to, whether it's dealing with the press, whether it's dealing with the public. It has given me a lot of helpful insight in that aspect. And I hadn't thought of that until you actually asked the question. But you gain so much experience when you're dealing with people whose level of public exposure is as high as some of the people who I was lucky enough to work with.
I've met and worked with many, 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 many famous people through my life. And my view has always been to treat them with the kindness and care and respect I would treat any person I would meet on the street.
Yes,
who's homeless
exactly.
or hungry or whatever, and that I don't make distinctions among people based on their fame. But I've also noticed that certain very famous people are incredibly wonderful and generous, and certain other very famous people are very needy, and you can't trust them. And sometimes you have to learn where to draw lines in terms of how much, and I'm not talking about sexual intimacy, but emotional intimacy you can permit, because sometimes you go down a rabbit hole with these people and you can't come out. And then because you are the bearer of their secrets, you have the burden of being the bearer of their secrets.
Right.
And so you have to sometimes really draw a line somewhere.
Yeah, you do have to draw those lines, because sometimes you may deal with someone who has certain demons that they're fighting in life, whether it's alcohol abuse, drug abuse, or things of that nature, that will oftentimes try to put you in a position, a compromised position, in helping them pursue those interests. And you have to, she said, you have to be able to draw the line, and it has to be a very distinctive line that you draw and say, no, this is where I can't help you beyond this point. So it's you do have to have those those boundaries and other rules that you have to abide by in those relationships in order to keep them as professional as possible.
One particular phenomenon that I've dealt with a lot, and I'm not naming names here at all because I respect people's privacy, and one of our colleagues refers to me as she says Fred Plotkin is a vault. In other words, I may have all these things I know, but I'm not opening the vault.
Mhm.
But one of the problems, issues that I've had to deal with often with people that I work with is stage fright and motivating them or calming them, depending on the situation, to get to the stage.
Mhm.
And there are certain artists, I'll name two, Aprile Milo and Grace Bumbry, who had no problem getting to the stage. It was like, out of my way, I'm ready. And that's wonderful. That's very exciting when you find an artist who is so savoring the moment.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I can name, except I won't, many artists, some of them very, very famous, who I had to jump through all kinds of hoops to calm them or reassure them or just hold them, in one case, carry them to the stage to get them out on the stage. And then they were fine.
Mhm.
And it's not about, do I have the ability? Stage fright is a thing unto itself. And I imagine that you saw that with certain people that you would work with, where they needed a huge amount of reassurance, not that they're good, but that they can do it.
Yeah, and sometimes it was just a matter of their insecurities getting the best of them,
Yeah.
and those insecurities would cause them to act out in certain ways that
Yes.
that some people would deem being difficult.
Mhm.
Um, I've experienced with one particular artist who, her insecurity, the way she dealt with it was that most people would say she would throw a tantrum, but it would come down to saying her saying she had nothing to wear on stage.
Ah.
And the time that I was with her, there were several instances where she would come out of her dressing room in a rage. I have nothing to wear. I'm not going on stage, blah, 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 blah. And she's actually made the demands that I need someone to find me a seamstress to make me a dress right now.
Mhm.
And on a couple of occasions they
I'll
did.
bet I work with that artist.
They found this person, a seamstress. And I apologize for the ringing phone.
That's okay.
Um, and they made her a dress on the spot. Um, but it came down, this happened maybe twice. And on the third stop, the venue was prepared, and that they had some of the executives from the producing entity on site. And the minute she came out of her dressing room and started making demands, then they kicked into action and said, okay, enough is enough.
Mhm.
If you want to work in this industry ever again, you'll be on that stage in 10 minutes.
Yep.
And sure enough, she was on that stage in less than 10 minutes and gave probably one of the best shows I've ever seen.
Sure. And again, I'm not naming names, but I worked with a very, 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 very famous musician who demanded that he have in his dressing room a pillow that was made of 65% goose down and 35% duck feathers, knowing that that particular ratio was not manufactured. So I had to go to Bloomingdale's to have specially made pillows produced for this artist for when he came to the Metropolitan Opera, and have a label created, because they didn't have such a label, indicating the ratio of feathers.
Oh, wow.
And when this artist retired and subsequently died, I took the pillows home, because what else do you do with them? But I had to keep them in my safe at the Metropolitan Opera House, knowing that whenever he would return, and I didn't know when that would be, that I would have the pillows at the ready. And
Right.
it was about being noticed, about being looked after. It was not about his ability as a musician. He was fantastic.
Mhm.
But it was really about his wanting to be a bit difficult and special, but also being cared for. And he was,
Yeah.
and he got it, and he came to the Met and he made beautiful music. And that's ultimately what we do for the public. But sometimes what happens behind the scenes is interesting unto itself, except I'm a vault, so I won't name names. You sang, you worked for and then sang for one of my favorite celebrities, Barack and Michelle Obama. And I thank you for that a lot. Anything that you did to help
I
them
never
get
got
to
to
the White
sing for
House.
them.
Oh,
I
you get
never
to
got to
sing for
sing
them.
for them. No, I
Okay,
never
well,
got to sing for them.
tell the story, because I know it led to your coming back to being a singer.
Right. I was working as an organizer for his campaign. They reached out after the primaries, and I had been working during the primaries. I was working very diligently for Hillary Clinton, and so once the primary is done, I decided, okay, I'm going to take a break and watch how things play out. And I received a phone call from a friend of mine who said, I received some correspondence from the Obama campaign, and I gave them your name, so don't be surprised if you get a phone call. So they called, and we did sort of a brief interview on the phone, and they said, we'd be interested in have you come work for us as an organizer. And I said, well, you do realize I was a Hillary supporter, correct? And they said, yes, that's why we want you. And I said, okay, well, let's give it a go. I knew very little about Senator Obama at that time, but have grown to greatly admire him as a human being, him and his wife.
Especially
our forever First Lady, Michelle Obama. But I worked as an organizer for the campaign, and as in organizing some events in my region. I was overseeing 5 counties in Missouri for the campaign, and they sent us some some of their I can't even think of the word for it now. Some of their surrogates came to our area.
Surrogates, yeah.
And we were planning some events for these surrogates. And I had asked one of the local beauty queens if she would come and sing the national anthem. And she had agreed. And the day comes around, and she gets cold feet and decides not to do it. And it was at that time that my boss pulled his card out of his pocket, and he says, I remember reading on your resume that you used to be an opera singer. So why don't you sing it? And I said, it's been a while since I've sung. I have no idea what's going to come out. He said, well, it doesn't really matter. They're not going to know. I was like, yes, but I'll know. But he convinced me to do it. So I, kind of snuck off to myself and did a quick warm up and came out and sang the anthem in the lowest key that I could possibly do it at the time. Because I was like, I don't know what's going to happen above the staff, so I'm going to have to find a key that's very low. So I picked the lowest key I could literally sing the anthem in, and sang it. And a couple weeks later, I had to repeat it, and that time I was more prepared. So I was actually warmed up and actually tried it in the key that I would normally have sung it in. And the second time is when I started hearing things in my voice and feeling things that immediately told me, this is not the same voice that you left the industry with. Things have changed. So once the campaign ended, I began kind of secretly studying on my own, using lesson tapes that I had from my time at Oberlin, and just spent time kind of retraining the voice to see what it was capable of. And it was during that time that I began kind of dallying around with some of the arias that I enjoyed, the Vesti la Giubba, and
from Pagliacci,
from Pagliacci, along with Che la mi creda from the Fanciulla, and noticed that the voice had taken on a much more, and I hate to use this word because I think it's so overused, a more burnished quality to it. And so it really piqued me. I kept working, and I eventually said, okay, I need to find another set of ears to make sure, someone I can trust to kind of confirm what I'm hearing. And so I went out and found a teacher and started working with her. And eventually after a year or so, she said, I really enjoy working with you, but I think it's time you get out and do something with this voice. And but it it took the next few years for me to be able to get my confidence to the point where I felt comfortable going out and auditioning. So I started with competition in 2012 for the National Opera Association conference, which that year just happened to be in Memphis, Tennessee. So it was very convenient for me. And I ended up winning it in a rather grand fashion. And that, my judges that year were conductor Stephen Osgood, Callan Asperian, soprano, and the great soprano Felicia Weathers.
Oh, yes, sure.
And each artist was brought out to sing in the finals. And based on their routine, the artists would come out and sing their first piece, and then they would ask for part of or all of a second piece. And when it came to my time, I come up and I sang my first piece. I started with the Dio mi potevi from Otello. And then they asked for I believe it was the Salut de Mère Chastapure from Faust. And I was prepared to leave the stage. And as I started to walk off, Miss Weathers holds up her hand and says, no, hold on. I'd like to hear the Peter Grimes.
Yes.
Now the Great Bear. And so I walk back to the center stage and sing the Peter Grimes. And then as I start to walk off again, Callan holds up her hand. She goes, I'd love to hear the Adorane le Couvreur. And so I go back and sing it again, and once again get ready to walk off the stage, and Miss Weathers again stops me. She goes, well, since we've done it, why don't we hear the Wagner as well, the Forging aria from Siegfried? She goes, you might as well sing the fifth one as well. So I basically sang all 5 of my pieces. And as I walk off stage, my colleagues were sitting backstage, and they said, well, we think we know who won this competition. And sure enough, I was announced as the winner, and that kind of kickstarted me back onto the path that has me sitting here with you today.
And that's where I first became aware of you. But I want to go back to the previous topic. For people outside of America, or even many Americans who don't know our national anthem, it's an incredibly hard piece of music to sing. Yes. Francis Scott Key, who wrote the music, did not write for voices, and he certainly didn't write for stadiums where people would be singing it together. Whitney Houston was one of the few people who could just do it without having to give it a second thought, but just about every other singer has to strategize his or her way through the anthem. So because it goes very low and very high, and that's why you said about finding your lowest key makes complete sense to me. But that being said, which is harder to sing? The national anthem of the United States, which is called the Star-Spangled Banner, or walking out on stage anywhere, not just the Met, in Aida at the very top of the opera and singing Falsi Cellista Aida, which is equally exposed and lows and highs and so on. Which is harder? I say the national anthem.
Overall, I think the national anthem is more difficult. But it was in a less. My having to do the Cellista Aida was in a more high pressure situation. But
I mean, just notes. I think Verdi.
But note wise, I think the anthem is much more difficult to sing.
Really, it just, I wish we had La Marseillaise or some other, anthem that is better able to be sung by lots and lots of people. Anyway,
I always thought "God Bless America" would make a better anthem.
Yes, also, or
America's Beautiful.
America. That's what I was going to say. But so you have begun, you began and are continuing to gain a wider audience. And I can tell you, to a man or woman, anyone I know who's worked with you has loved the experience. And when I said at the very beginning that you are a much loved figure in our business, by colleagues, I meant exactly what I said, because sometimes managements can be challenging, but colleagues are a different measure. And people I know, also other tenors, point to you as someone they greatly admire, and tenors don't always do that.
No.
But I've had, I've heard, because I've discussed you, or I've asked these fellows, talk about singers you like right now. Many of them mention you. And so that's really it's a great thing, in fact. And now that you are singing leading roles such as Otello and Manrico and Radames in your Met debut, you were the cover. I want people to know that. And on December 17th of 2022, you stepped in for your colleague, and you had a rather sensational debut. And it attracted a lot of attention. And that's very recent. That's 6 months ago, not even 5 months ago. And since then, you've been on this trajectory that's rather remarkable and very gratifying, I would say, but also very demanding. What have you been up to since December 17th, 2022?
Oh wow, it's been somewhat of a whirlwind. I went from, let's see, the last year in general has been somewhat of a whirlwind. I lost my father last May. I lost my eldest sister in November, just shortly before my unscheduled Met debut. So I made the debut on December 17th. And in January, I made my Carnegie Hall debut, singing the role of Moses in the Nathaniel Dett's The Ordering of Moses. I've made Cleveland Orchestra debut, Philadelphia Orchestra debut. It's been quite the ride so far, and then to have that topped off with this past February being recognized by former First Lady Michelle Obama as part of her Black History Month celebration, which was completely surprising. Was completely unaware that was going to happen. Actually, a friend of mine, I woke up that morning to a message from a friend of mine with a link, and my first reaction was, "Oh, this is spam. I'm not clicking the link." And so I texted him back and said, "Has your account been compromised? I got a random link from you." He goes, "No. It's not spam. Go click the link." And sure enough, it was a very lovely. I guess you can call it a tribute of sorts from First Lady Michelle Obama on her Twitter, and then to find out it was that she shared it on all of her social media platforms. It was just somewhat overwhelming, and so since then it's been I've been doing quite a bit of media, and I'm here in Cleveland right now doing Fanchula. Then I head out to, performances in Ojai, California coming up. I've been invited to do a special recital by the Nashville Symphony on Juneteenth.
So we're going to be explain to listeners who don't know what Juneteenth is for Americans.
So Juneteenth is a celebration of the day when all of the slaves finally received their freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but it took some time for word to travel to places like Texas.
The message still has not arrived.
They're still trying to get the message down there. But it's a holiday that celebrates the freeing of the slaves, of all the slaves, so to speak. So I'm really honored to be presenting the inaugural recital for this new series that the Nashville Symphony is doing. And we're going to be presenting a program of all spirituals. So I'm really looking forward to that, along with Mark Markham, will be playing piano for me.
Mhm.
And it's a wonderful program which we've done.
Make them hear you, a spiritual journey.
A spiritual journey, yeah.
Yeah.
And it is quite the program, and yeah, I'm very excited to be presenting it.
I was going to ask you about Mark later, and I think I'll do that. I have a question that I hope you don't consider indelicate or even offensive, because it's not meant to be.
No,
And
no.
if you do, I want you to please tell me. You mentioned about Black History Month, which is February, which, as Richard Pryor, the famous Black comedian, said, is given to Black people because it's the shortest month of the year.
Yeah.
But I obviously, or I hope it's obvious, deeply care, and I'm very concerned that Black people and all people in America be accorded equal rights and protections in everything. My concern is this, that to me, the greatest singer non-opera was Ella Fitzgerald. Gwen Ifill was a wonderful journalist who was Black. There are many
Mhm.
Black Americans who have achieved all kinds of magnificent things in all pursuits, not just the arts. And the United States Postal Service, when they have honored Ella Fitzgerald and Gwen Ifill and others, list them as Black heritage rather than great singers, great journalists, whatever. And
Mm.
by classifying them by their race, by their color, rather than by their achievement, it's singling out one aspect of them that millions of people share, rather than the aspect of them that very few people have achieved at that level.
Right.
And I hear this in discourse among Black people, but also among people who are not Black. Obviously, we want to honor Black excellence. We want to, in every way, acknowledge the achievements of Black Americans from 1619 forward, from the very moment that the first Black people were brought to these shores. But by defining them as Black, when frankly it's obvious that they're Black, rather
Mhm.
than as singers, artists, journalists, scientists, doctors, politicians, presidents, first ladies, religious figures, whatever it is that they do. I've not discussed this with many Black friends, with one, and he kind of agreed with me, but he didn't want me to mention his name publicly. But do you have feelings on that? And if you disagree with me, please do disagree with me.
Well, I think it depends on the situation. I think in the instance of my singing Radames, it was important to point out that I was, in the history of the Met, I was the first Black singer to sing this
Mhm.
role of an African character. So I think each situation has to be evaluated on its own merits. But I do agree with you in that to cast someone like an Ella Fitzgerald or Gwen Ifill as a Black
Black
journalist
heritage.
or a Black heritage stamp, as opposed to just an American stamp, or just a stamp.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of to me it's almost saying that their skin color was more important than their achievements.
Yeah, that's how I
And
feel. And
and
we're
and
talking about stamps because for Americans, the United States Postal Service, getting a stamp is an acknowledgement of your contribution to our nation and its history
yeah,
and its
yeah.
life. And it's like winning an award posthumously, because they're almost every case they're given after people have died, usually 5 years after. And you know, when they did an opera singers series, they didn't say that Richard Tucker was Jewish or that Rosa Punzel was from Baltimore. They just said
Mhm.
opera singers. And when they've had jazz singers before that, or jazz musicians, they had Duke Ellington, but they didn't say he was a Black musician. He was to me, the greatest jazz composer ever, and wonderful orchestra leader and everything else that he did. But they didn't identify him by his race, but in more recent times, it's become a Black heritage series.
Right.
And I just don't want that to enter the discourse beyond the obvious. It's obvious when a person is whatever color he or she is, but to identify them by that for their achievement, rather than saying this gentleman who happens to be Black is a fantastic surgeon.
Mhm.
We're happy that Black people are, being able to become surgeons, go to medical school and all that. But it troubles me. It's kind of like creating a separate category.
Yeah.
To me, inclusion happens more when we just say the surgeon, the singer, rather than the Black surgeon or the Black singer, unless, of course, in the case of music, they're doing music that's associated with the history of persons of African descent, like spirituals, which non-Black people can sing too, but obviously the heritage is there for that for all the obvious reasons. I didn't
Yeah, I mean,
intend to
it's the
go in
same,
that direction. Yeah.
It's a matter of people being willing to and acknowledging that Black history is American history, and it's
Yeah.
not separate from, it's not one and of itself, but it's all American history. So while personally we do have Black History Month, every day is a day to celebrate Black history for me.
Absolutely.
And I strive to learn something new each and every day about my background and my heritage and the accomplishments and accomplishments of Black people and throughout American history, not just during the month of February, which is why oftentimes I even turn down opportunities to do programs during Black History Month, because why not invite me in May or June or October, whenever? Why should I only be invited somewhere during Black History Month? So
well, I'm going to give you a suggestion for a May concert for next year. The finest recital I've ever been to, and I've been to hundreds of thousands of recitals and often backstage, but somehow the one that sticks in my memory the most was done maybe 30 years ago by Elizabeth Söderström, the Swedish soprano, and James Levine, the pianist. And it was done at Alice Tully Hall in New York, and it was done on Mother's Day, and I took my mother, and they picked 24 songs and arias about motherhood, and they did not do the Schumann, about the life cycle of a woman, Frauen lieben und leben. They did 24 wonderfully selected songs by 22 composers, and it was magnificent. And so next year for May, when we have Mother's Day again, do that theme, but music that you like with that involved, because then, that's universal. Let's put it that way. Everyone has a mother, and you can pick from all kinds of music. And believe me, it'll sell out. It'll sell out because of Limmie Pulliam, but it'll sell out even faster because the theme. And it was not forced when they did it. It was just a very beautiful afternoon. And I took my mother, and you can take your mom or sing for your mom, or do it in Missouri, do it in Kennett if you want, or Memphis or somewhere, or St. Louis, somewhere nearby, and gather family together and have them bring their mothers and, any women who are mothers and all that. Because we want, with music and with making art, I believe, to go for the universal rather than the targeted and the segmented.
Right.
And they'll say it's May, it's not Black History Month, it's not anything, it's May. So think about that.
I definitely will.
Now, Mark Markham was a wonderful pianist I know for a long time, and he played a lot. He collaborated a lot with Jesse Norman, and who I also knew quite a lot. And as I ask all of my guests, I asked you to name me some artists who you find particularly inspiring, and I wrote them down. Luciano Pavarotti, yes. Leontyne Price, yes. Grace Bumbry, yes, and we'll talk about her. Francis Walker Slocum and Moses Hogan. Would you talk about those artists?
Well, my connection to them is both through Oberlin. Moses was an alum of Oberlin, and Mrs. Walker was is also an alum, but she also taught piano there, and she is the sister of the great composer George Walker.
Oh, sure.
And
who I should interrupt and say the National Symphony under John Andrea Noseda is doing a complete retrospective of his works this year.
Ah, wonderful.
Yeah, and recordings too.
But yeah, I first started singing Moses's music as a student at Oberlin, and was the first time I was exposed to it, and was immediately moved by how well he wrote for the voice, and how well his and how beautiful his accompaniments were, to accompany these traditional spirituals and whatnot. So I found it very moving, and it was, and I was one of those people who's always trying to find new spirituals and things by Black composers to include in my repertoire, but it was always difficult because, and I hate to say it, in that a lot of the more contemporary things that were written during that time weren't very vocally well written.
Congenial.
Yes. There was a lack of knowledge of writing for the voice that just wasn't there. And I'm glad to see that things are starting to improve in that area with so many young composers who are out there now writing great pieces. With Sean Okpekbolo and Damian Jeter and others who are writing just fabulous pieces. Rhiannon Giddens with her Omar, who
just won a Pulitzer Prize.
And with she and Michael Abels, and it's really great that I'm glad to know that composers are really starting to really focus on writing and learning more about the human voice and what it takes to write for the voice, and not just slapping notes on a page and say, okay, this is my vocal line. It was back in the day, many of the pieces I was given by younger composers, it was almost like doing calculus and trying to sing them, and I was never good at calculus. So it was, you can imagine what it would sound like me trying to sing these pieces. But it's back to Moses singing his music in college, and then meeting Mrs. Slocum, Mrs. Walker. She was, and her brother to some extent, when he would come visit, were instrumental in teaching me how to sing spirituals properly. She came back for a visit, and I remember presenting on a departmental recital. I presented some spirituals, and afterwards she came and pulled me aside and she goes, young man, I'd love to speak with you. And she goes, I really enjoyed your performance. You have a lovely voice, but we need to talk about how you present spirituals and how they're supposed to be presented. And so she took the time to sit with me and over the next few weeks and just kind of, take me under her wing and teach me the ins and outs of singing spirituals and the importance of not trying to, I think it was difficult for a lot of young Black singers to sing in that dialect. But
because the words were from the 19th century or even earlier, and words such as gwine, Gwine, rather than going, and that it is a bit like singing Cavaliere Rusticana rather than in Italian when you're singing in Sicilian, or Porgy and Bess, which is from the 1920s, which has the speech of the Gullah people of
Mhm.
South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And it's a different kind of speech, but it's real and genuine unto themselves.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something, and then you can add to it. I want listeners to know that spirituals and gospel is not the same thing.
No.
Spirituals comes from a much older tradition. Gospel was founded, we typically say in the early 1920s, by Thomas A. Dorsey, who was from
Mhm.
Mississippi, but he lived in Chicago. His wife died, and he wrote a song called Precious Lord,
Precious
Take My
Lord.
Hand.
Yeah.
And it evolved into a different style of singing. I love both spirituals and gospel, but I think that many people mix the two, and they're really not. Limmie, would you talk about what they told you about how the insights that you gained about how to sing spirituals very specifically?
Well, it was more so just, and this is something that I carry with me today in singing spirituals. Miss Walker, she said to me when she said, where does your sound come from? She asked, where does your sound come from? And I said, well, obviously it comes from here, and it's projected here. And she goes, yes, that's technically true. And she said, but your sound should start here before it reaches here. And to effectively sing this music, you have to have even an extra sense of being more vulnerable than than normal with regular repertoire, and that it's, you can't be embarrassed of, oh, they're going to think I'm weird singing in this dialect, or they're going to laugh at me singing in this dialect. You just have to embrace it and put yourself out there to present the music as it was intended. I grew up singing gospel music in church. My father was a preacher, and so I grew up singing gospel music almost on a weekly basis. And when I first started singing spirituals, I was sort of presenting them in that same manner, because I didn't know any different. So she is the one who also kind of ingrained in me that there's a difference. Spirituals are not gospel music. Sure, some of them may have the same tune, but they're not presented in the same way. So now it's, regardless of the program I do, I usually try to include some spirituals, strictly for the purpose of showing that they are just as important as the European literature that we present. Whether it's Schubert, Schumann, Mahler, things of that nature. These pieces are just as important and worthy of presentation, and are on par with many of those compositions.
So I'll ask a technical question. Sorry to interrupt,
sure.
if I may. When Francis Walker Slocum said that it should begin here, and you kind of pointed either to your heart or your solar plexus, I'm not quite sure.
To the heart, to my heart.
Heart. Did she mean from the emotional point of view? So it was an emotional thing rather than a technical thing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was more.
Yeah.
That's the way I took it. It was more of an emotional thing, and that the sound starts here. That it has to start here from a genuine place in order to be produced in a manner that's going to touch and move people, to move your listeners. If it's just me utilizing my voice with no sense of feeling, no sense of commitment to it, sure, it'll probably sound lovely, but it's not going to have an emotional impact on your listeners. So whenever, you know, when you sing something like, just generically, Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me here? I wish I never was born. That's just very generic. But if you,
And yet,
Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me here? There's a difference in where the sound is coming from. And that's that's a lesson I'll carry with me till the end of my days. And
yeah, just sort of
I even apply that music to the operatic literature that I sing.
yeah.
I apply that to the operatic literature as well.
I just sort of a question I've never thought of before, which is why I love talking to the likes of you. When one sings a Mahler song, a Schubert song, we know who wrote the accompaniment. Often with spirituals, we don't necessarily know who wrote the accompaniment, and it has been added by a musician at a later point when the notes were notated. So therefore, the input of a musical hand, has interceded on a work that already exists in the oral tradition and the sung tradition. I've never thought about this before. Maybe Mark Markham or someone else is also, I should ask those people. What has to be brought in the accompaniment to the words that you are singing?
Well,
Because sometimes if the accompaniment is overwrought, in my view, that can wreck the sincerity of the music.
Yes, it really can. And I'm so lucky to have a partner in Mark, to be able to do this, because there are several pieces that we do which are completely improvised on the program. So to have someone with Mark's not only his musical knowledge, but his knowledge of the repertoire, the spiritual repertoire, is priceless. Because I know that no matter what I do, and it can change from night to night on some of these pieces, I know that he's going to be right there with me. Never once do I feel like have I felt that he was creating an accompaniment that was meant to overshadow, or even coming from a place of wanting to be showy. It's always been it's always come from a place of sincerity, and come from a place of a deep respect for the literature, and for the struggles that produced a lot of these songs.
Yeah.
And
Do I recall correctly, is he from Alabama or somewhere in the South?
he's from Florida.
Florida, okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I wonder if that brings anything as well. And he's white, and whether that brings something that were he from Maine or from Oregon, or it might be different. Who knows?
I don't know, but it's he obviously has a great love of this literature and just music in general. And it was one of those random things that we ended up working together. I've known of Mark for a number of years through his work with Ms. Norman.
Yeah.
And and through social media, we became acquainted, and it was one of those things where I just randomly decided to write him a message and say, I would love to have the opportunity to work with you one day, should the opportunity present itself. And eventually it did. And we did our first recital the week before everything shut down for the pandemic.
Yep.
At my alma mater at Oberlin. And have been working together ever since. It's
As
been a
he,
joy.
and I should say that I knew, I don't think one can say they knew Jesse Norman, even if they were with her constantly. One experienced Jesse Norman, in my view. And because she was extraordinary, she was complicated, but she was extraordinary, and I respected her greatly. And we collaborated on lots of things through the years. The last one being we co-taught master classes at Oxford, University of Oxford, about Richard Strauss. And
Oh,
we didn't plan that. We were both there doing other things, and we just kind of improvised it. And she was terrific, but she was also a challenge, and she was inscrutable in many ways. But she and Mark Markham formed a very tight musical and artistic
mhm.
bond. So the question is, has he shared with you musical insights or things that he learned from Jesse Norman musically, nothing else, that he's sharing with you?
Yeah, he has, and it's, things that he's learned from her, and whether musical anecdotes, he's also shared some of the personal experiences they had together, that he thought would be helpful. But it was, obviously that they enjoyed a very friendly and not just a musical relationship, that they were much like my work as a bodyguard. He was privy to some very intimate aspects of her life that most people were not privy to. And, to have someone like Mark who has that experience and is so willing to share it with artists like myself and others, and is you can't put a price on something like that.
And
And
she was profoundly, sorry to interrupt, she was profoundly engaged in politics more than most opera people I know are.
yeah,
Many opera
yeah,
people may care about politics and follow them and vote as
but they
they
don't speak so
believe.
publicly about it. Yeah.
Spoke very publicly, and she supported Stacey Abrams for governor of Georgia,
Mhm.
where Jesse was from, very actively. She supported all kinds of environmental causes,
Mhm.
women's causes, Buddhism. It was, she was like a diamond with prisms, and whatever light you would shine on her, you would get the Buddhist Jesse Norman as opposed to the Wagnerian Jesse Norman.
Yeah, and it's interesting enough. I've had some in the industry who have said to me that maybe I shouldn't voice my political views as freely as I often do. But it's, I'm a citizen,
Yeah.
and I have my opinions and the right to express them as much as anyone else.
Yep. And I've seen, just in fact, in today's social media, people in our business expressing views that I find absolutely abhorrent. And they know that.
Yeah.
And I work with them, and we have cordial
Yeah.
working relationships, but it's very hard because they put things out there that I just find horrific. Not even, unacceptable or different from my own views, but absolutely
Mhm.
inhuman. But that's for another time. But that's part of the price that comes with being open about our political views. So, I want, as we wind up, to talk. Well, let's first get them out of the way. Luciano Pavarotti and Leontyne Price. I completely get it about both of them, why they
Mhm.
are models. But is there any particular thing about
Well,
Luciano and Leontyne to point out?
my introduction to opera was through Luciano Pavarotti. What was my high school choir director, who one day asked me to stay after class and said, she said, "Have you ever heard of opera?" I said, "No." And so she hands me a piece of music and a cassette tape and says, "I want you to take this home and listen to it and see if you can learn it." And it was a recording of Luciano Pavarotti singing Una furtiva lagrima,
Elisir d'Amore.
and
Yeah.
from the L'Elisir d'Amore. And I was immediately intrigued by the sound because I'd never heard a sound like that before. Um, so after listening to this aria and learning it, basically mimicking what I was hearing language-wise, because I didn't speak Italian at the time, I just started to in the evenings, I started to allow the cassette tape to play on. And so I began to hear other arias like Luce Male Stelle, or Recondita Armonia, Celeste Aida, things of that nature. And it really started to, the sound became an obsession for me because I'd never heard this sound. And then to learn that, I learned that they were doing this, typically do this unamplified, no microphones, singing over full orchestra. I was sold at that point to think that a human was capable of doing that. I had to learn how. Eventually, I began to search out other artists, and that's when I came across Leontyne Price after seeing her on PBS on several PBS specials, which back then you had your TV Guide magazine.
Yes.
I began getting my TV guides, and each week I would go through day by day to find out what was coming on PBS with regard to opera, and was able to view and record many programs that included our Jesse Norman and the Richard Tucker galas, and the mostly Mozart Festival used to appear on PBS back then. The Live from Lincoln Centers, Live from Metropolitan Opera, so many different programs introduced me to many, many, many artists. But it was those introductions to artists like Leontyne and Jesse and George Shirley, Simon Estes, that kind of made me realize that yes, this is possibly something that I could do as a career. This isn't just meant for Caucasians or Italians or whatever, what have you, that this is something that is a possibility for me. And that sort of sealed it for me, was to see, Ms. Price, and then to have the opportunity as an undergrad to meet Madame Bumbry for the first time when she visited Oberlin. She paid a surprise visit to see what then was our Vocal Arts Center.
If I may, I want to save Grace for a couple of minutes.
Okay, we'll save that. But yeah, it was those artists who made me realize that this career was a potentiality for me.
Yeah. I don't know if you know that Luciano Pavarotti made his American recital debut in Missouri.
Yes, he did.
He did. Liberty,
Missouri.
Missouri. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we were friends, and he told me that the thing that he remembers most about that appearance, apart from the nerves, and his pianist was Eugene Cohn, by the way, was that something called the all-you-can-eat salad bar buffet.
Yes.
And he said to me, "America is a great country."
Yes, but, there are lots of all-you-can-eat buffets in Missouri.
Leontyne Price and Luciano only sang together once, and that was in San Francisco Opera in Aida. And if memory serves, it was supposed to have been Margaret Price, but she withdrew, and Leontyne was brought in and said she would only do it if she's paid $1 more than Luciano. And he was fine with that, of course. And she did it. And I'm not from San Francisco, but everyone I know who lives in Northern California claims to have been at that performance that day. It would be impossible, because we're talking about 50,000 people who insist that they them in Aida, by the way. And the only time they sang together in New York was October 22nd, 1983, was the Met Centennial Gala, and I was performance manager. And they sang the duet from Act 2 of Un ballo in Maschera. And it was glorious. And you came to realize, I'm getting goosebumps as I say this, why did we not have them singing together more? It was just so obvious. He sang with Tibaldi, he sang with Franey, with Caballé, with Sutherland, with all these people, and thank you for that. But to have had him singing with Leontyne Price in Tosca, in Madame Butterfly, in a lot of the Verdi rep, would have been even Mozart, if you can imagine that. I would hear them sing not spirituals. I would not want to hear him do spiritual, but just about anything else. Absolutely. It's a shame, but therefore we treasure those memories. And
Yeah.
I will say that Balo and Mosca duet is available on video, so people can find it.
Yeah, I watch it frequently on YouTube.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of seeing Miss Price live in her farewell recital tour.
Mm-hmm.
And she came to Denison University, which was a couple hours from Oberlin. So we took a group of students to the recital, along with my teacher at the time was our chaperone, Richard Miller, and we had the great pleasure. I had an obsession with my daily ritual when I would get to the conservatory was to stop in the library and listen to Miss Price sing Pace Pace Mio Dio. And so it was
from La Forza del Destino.
La Forza del Destino.
Yeah.
And I still remember to this day sitting 4 or 5 rows back from the stage at her recital when that music began. And when she hit that first note, the tears just began to fall. Yeah. And it was one of those moments that I will never, ever, ever, ever forget. And then to have the opportunity to meet her afterwards was one of those moments to where and the funny thing about meeting her afterwards is that little did we know was that she and my teacher had a previous relationship in their younger years. Through their time, as we were waiting to get our program signed, she kept looking in his direction as he was standing off to the side, letting the students go through the line. And so finally she goes, "Excuse me, sir, do I know you?" And he says, "Well, we have met." And, and she said, "Would you kindly give me more information?" He goes, "Well, we used to have breakfast in San Francisco with Mr. Björling." And she leans back in her chair. She goes, "Richard Miller." And as students, we immediately were like, "Oh, how could you not tell us that you knew Leontyne Price of all people after all this?" But he was just as shocked that she remembered him as we were that they knew each other. And that was one of my greatest memories.
Back in February, her birthday was February 10th. An artist was supposed to join me, but he was unable to. And I just decided rather than cancel my February 10th show, I would do a tribute to Leontyne Price because I was with her a lot and worked with her, and often in this situation of backstage after performances. And in my experience in all the world, not just in opera, I've never met a person with a better memory than Leontyne Price. And she remembered everyone. And she remembered a young man who came to her when he was no longer such a young man. And he said, "Miss Price, I've enjoyed your performances, and I will use my best Georgia pronunciation." She looked at him and she said, "Florida." In other words, Florida. "Yes, ma'am." "St. Petersburg or St. Augustine?" "St. Augustine." "Yes, ma'am." "And you wanted to be a doctor. Did you become a doctor?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, good. I'm proud of you." And the thing about her, I mean, she recognized when he was very young, and there he was again. So I want to ask you if you remember your interaction with her on that day, because she had a way of turning things around to talk to you about you rather than talk about herself.
Well, she knew that we were all young, aspiring singers. And, and now I'm not one who gets starstruck, but I was completely starstruck, and just to be in her presence and to see this woman who I revered as an artist, and without whom many of us would not be pursuing careers, or not enjoying the careers that we have, was just one of those moments. I was. It's one of the few moments I've been speechless in front of a person, to where all I could say was, muster through the tears was simply a thank you. A thank you for all that you've done and for the doors that you've helped open for those of us who are following in your footsteps. But it was just, yeah, it's still.
Did she say, I often heard her say, and again, I'm using my Mississippi, New York City, Mississippi drawl, I'm honored. I'm honored. I'm honored. Which
Well,
was
I don't know. I
often
don't know if she said that or not, but it was just,
okay.
she was, it was just, it was one of those moments that I'll never forget.
Yeah.
But I was far too emotional to say most of what I wanted to say going in. If I had the opportunity to meet her, or if I had the opportunity to talk to her today, I would hope things would go much differently.
I want to conclude by talking about someone who died last week, who is from Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, Grace Bumbry,
Mhm.
who Leontyne was born February 10th, 1927, and Grace January something, 1937, so 10 years younger. They sang a fair amount together. There's a very famous recording of Aida in which Leontyne sang Aida and Grace sang Amneris, and you could feel the vinyl melting when you hear them singing together in Act 2, Scene 1. And Grace Bumbry is often described as being the next generation of Black artists after Leontyne, even though it's just 10 years different. And Shirley Verrett, who I adored and revered, was 1933. So they're all more or less of the same era. Jesse Norman, 1945. Right. And but Grace Bumbry, and I mean this not in any mean way at all, was singular among all these people.
Indeed.
For many reasons. One of which was that she began as a mezzo, but she sang a lot of soprano roles. She was a very famous Salome, for example. She was a fantastic Tosca. She sang both Amneris and Aida, and I don't know if you've ever seen this, but she once, in a moment of immodesty, produced a video in which she sang both Amneris and Aida facing off in Act 2, Scene 1. Have you ever seen that?
I have not.
It's on YouTube, I believe. It's worth finding, unless it was pulled, because just to see her singing both roles and acting in both roles against one another, but against herself, was really something. You said that she came to Oberlin. You met her there.
Yeah, she there was one afternoon I had a voice lesson with my teacher, and I was one of his assistants working in the Vocal Arts Center, which was kind of, at the time, was sort of a groundbreaking center with lots of equipment to analyze the voice and production of the voice. And he said, we have a guest coming this afternoon, and I would like you to give them a tour of the lab. That was all the information he gave me. And so I arrive at the time in the student lounge that I was supposed to be there, and I'm sitting there waiting. And all of a sudden I see this rather large floor-length fur coat walk behind me. And this regal woman is standing in the lobby, in the lounge. And I was like, oh, okay, who's not doing it? And then she turned around and I said, oh my God, that's Grace Bumbry. And so I got myself together and walked up to her, and I said, excuse me, are you Grace Bumbry? And she goes, indeed I am. And so I introduced myself, and then she said, I'm looking for Richard Miller's studio. And so I said, oh, he happens to be my teacher. I can take you there. So I walk her to his studio, and we knock on the door, and he answers, and they greet each other. And he goes, oh, Limmie, this is our guest who I would like you to take to the lab. And so off we go to our vocal arts lab. And it wasn't a large room. It was two rooms together, but it wasn't, they were formerly organ studios. So I began the tour and began playing videos. We had lots of videos from the Firestone Voice of Firestone series. And, so we played videos. I played several videos from that, and also videos of her that we had to show her how the spectrographic analysis and all of that worked. And, as we were going through, we were playing, different singers, and, we would play certain singers, and she would kind of under her breath a little bit, and and
I could
it
hear her
finally came
saying, well, she does her best.
right. Right. Okay. Well, that's one way to do it.
She tried.
And so as we were playing her videos, I explained to her, I said, and we also allow students to come in. We do live analysis of students and anyone who wants to come in. So I did a demonstration for her of the live vocal analysis. And to my surprise, when I got done, she says, well, would it be okay if I tried it? And I said, well, of course. So she walks up to the microphone, and I'm literally less than 3 feet away from her. And she goes, well, I don't know how it's going to be. I'm not warmed up, so don't, like, no worries. And she opens her mouth, and this sound that I can only describe as otherworldly came out of her head. And all I remember is her looking at me after she cuts off. She goes, how was that? And without looking at the screen, without even looking at the screen, I was like, that was fabulous. And I was like, oh, well, here, this is why it's fabulous, And I go into the explanation, and I was able to do a screenshot of her from a video of her singing the exact same phrase, maybe 15, 20 years earlier, and putting them side by side. And I mean, you couldn't tell one from the other.
Yes.
But it was such an amazing time I got to spend with her that afternoon. And, fast forward until, I guess, maybe, I can't remember how long it was, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, on social media. It may not even been that long. It may be 2 or 3, 4 years ago, maybe. I remember getting a note from a friend on social media, on Facebook. And it was a link to Miss Bumbry's page, and she had posted a note to me on her Facebook page, which I was very shocked, and obviously thought, well, this is obviously a fake page. This can't be really her.
It was.
But it turned out to be her. And I was very moved to think that that someone of her caliber would even think twice about someone like me. So I got this nice little note here, and it says, Limmie, you are amazing, and I am a huge fan. Keep up the good work. And that is how we reconnected.
Yeah.
And began corresponding, and eventually led to me during the pandemic. I decided to do a little interview series of my own, but I wanted to speak with some artists who had inspired me, and artists of different genres and whatnot. So I decided to do a legend series, but wasn't able to get everyone that I wanted. But I was able to get Cheryl Milnes and Grace Bumbry to appear. And she and I had a lovely chat. And it was nice to be able to remind her of her visit to Oberlin, and to talk about our connection with Missouri, and with her being from St. Louis. And, so it was very nice to finally, to years later, to have the opportunity to connect with her and actually form somewhat of a friendship. So
She was
so
not
to
the first opera singer I heard. I was taken, believe it or not, when I was not quite 3 years old. I heard Eleanor Steber, and then I heard, just about everyone in the 1960s, even though I was a baby and a toddler. But when I was 11, I heard Maria Callas when I was 9, but somehow that didn't even get me. I don't know why. Tito Gobi did in the same cast, but not Callas. But 2 years later, I think I was more prepared. I heard Grace Bumbry sing Orfeo in the Gluck Orfeo, and that completely knocked me out. And it was that made me think, well, gee, opera, there's something to opera. And then I studied Carmen, and she was a wonderful Carmen. And when I taught and teach Carmen, I used her film with Vickers, even though Vickers, who I adored, but was not the greatest Don Jose, but she was perfect in that. And I would make a point of going to Grace Bumbry performances until I went off to college and didn't get to hear her where I was until I moved to Italy when I was 19, and I got to work with her at La Scala in Aida, where she was singing Amneris with Montserrat Caballero, and we got to know each other better then and enjoyed each other, but there was always a lot of banter and one-upmanship, but it was in a fun way. But she knew that I was 19, but I was serious. And I think that what I really loved, among many things about her, was she was very serious. And there were no shortcuts musically. She never faked anything. Everything was fully understood, all the languages, the musicology, everything, but could also make it vibrant and alive and not just studied and academic.
Right.
And that's what made her so extraordinary. And then when I came back to the States and worked at the Met, she came for several things, most famously a beautiful Eboli with Domingo and Franey and an all-star cast and Levine conducting that's recorded on video from 1983. And we continued to work on a lot of things and see one another. And I would always go to performances she did. And one time at Carnegie Hall, she did a recital in which she sang glorious, all kinds of complicated music. But when she came out on stage, beautifully dressed, of course, she had arranged ahead of time that the piano lid be closed. And for no good reason, but there was a reason. When she came out, she acknowledged the audience and then looked at the piano and expressed mock horror. How could they close the piano lid? So she rolled up the sleeves on her gown and she lifted up the lid and she pulled up the stick to support it and opened the piano so that she could sing, let's say, against that big piano. Did like that with her hands, and she said, "And now I can perform for you." And it was all an act, but it was like vaudeville. But then she did the most serious music you can imagine, and did it exquisitely well. We miss her. She was a huge contribution to our artistic lives. In the case of the likes of us, our personal lives. And I just wanted to take a few minutes, because you knew her, to pay tribute to Grace Bumbry, who died last week, I think May 7th, if I recall. So, Limmie Pulliam, I'm just going to add one word. I'm really proud of you. I think you're fantastic, and I just loved having the opportunity to talk with you and have my audience get to know you. And this video will be available and people can watch. And I think they will see the artistry that those of us in the profession have known and are just ecstatic that it is coming to a wider audience. So tomorrow night in Cleveland, Ohio, you are singing in a concert version with the Cleveland Orchestra of Puccini's La Fanciulla del West. And who's your castmates?
Singing Emily McGee is singing Minnie.
Oh, good.
Roman Burdenko is singing Jack Rance.
Jack Rance, yeah.
And
you don't have to name all the guys. It's okay.
Yeah, there's a lot. And Yuri Samorlov is singing our Sonora. But it's such a wonderful cast, and they've really outdone themselves with their casting on this one.
And Franz Welser-Most is conducting.
Yes, Franz Welser-Most is conducting.
Severance Hall.
Yes, at Severance Hall, which is, as
you know, as Severance Hall,
a gorgeous hall. And such a joy to sing in. It's one of the best halls for singing that I've ever been in.
Wonderful. I look forward to hearing you soon and often, and I commend Limmie Pulliam to audiences around the world. Thank you very much, Limmie.
Thank you so much, Fred.
Sure.